Daniel had spent years in search and rescue. He knew the sounds animals made in the forest. But the night he and Emily camped deep in the mountains of New Zealand, something started circling their tent. Slow, patient, careful. And after listening to it for a few minutes, Daniel realized something that made his stomach tighten. Whatever was outside was trying not to make noise. Daniel and Emily weren't new to remote places. Every year they traveled somewhere isolated, somewhere wild, somewhere most people would never think to camp. Over the years they had slept in deserts, forests, and mountain valleys across different parts of the world. Isolation didn't scare them. They loved it. And this year, their trip had brought them to the mountains of New Zealand. Daniel worked as a search and rescue technician. When hikers disappeared in the bush or climbers got injured in remote terrain, Daniel was often part of the team sent to find them. The job demanded speed, strength, endurance, CrossFit before sunrise, rugby on weekends. Daniel was used to steep mountains, unpredictable weather, and carrying injured people for kilometers through difficult terrain. Emily's connection to the outdoors came from a different place. Emily taught wilderness survival courses, navigation, shelter building, fire starting, how to stay calm when something goes wrong far from civilization. Her students were often surprised when they first met her. Emily didn't look like what most people imagined when they pictured a survival instructor. She was calm, soft-spoken, warm, but she was also incredibly strong. Powerlifting was her hobby. Heavy squats, deadlifts, strength built slowly with patience and discipline. But Emily's greatest strength wasn't physical. It was observation. She noticed things, changes in the wind, birdsong suddenly stopping, footprints most people would walk past, small details that meant something in the wilderness. Together they made a very good team outdoors, which is why neither of them were worried when they chose a valley deep in the New Zealand mountains for this year's trip. No marked trails, no nearby campsites, no cell reception, just forest, just quiet. Exactly the kind of place they loved. The hike into the valley had taken most of the afternoon. The trail disappeared long before they reached their destination. After that, it was just Daniel's GPS and Emily's map guiding them through thick forest and uneven ground. By the time they reached the clearing beside a narrow stream, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. It was exactly the kind of place they loved. Quiet, remote, surrounded by tall trees that blocked the wind. They pitched their tent near the edge of the clearing and built a small fire beside a fallen log. As darkness settled in, the forest filled with sound. Wind brushing through the branches, water moving slowly over rocks in the stream, and the occasional distant crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. It all felt normal, comforting even. The next morning they followed the stream further into the valley. The forest was dense but easy enough to move through. Soft earth underfoot, moss-covered logs, the steady sound of water beside them. After about an hour, Emily slowed slightly. Daniel noticed and turned. "You good?" Emily held up a hand. "Wait." She tilted her head slightly toward the trees, listening. Daniel stood quietly beside her. "What?" Emily pointed into the forest. "Something's moving over there." Daniel stared into the trees. Nothing moved. After a few seconds, he shrugged. "I don't hear anything." Emily frowned slightly. "It was there. Branches shifting." Daniel smiled. "You and your superhuman hearing." Emily rolled her eyes. "You say that now." Daniel chuckled. "I'm serious. You hear things no one else does." Emily smiled faintly. "Comes in handy when I'm teaching people how not to die out here." Daniel grinned. Fair point. They kept walking. But over the next few hours, the same thing kept happening. Emily would pause, tilt her head, listening. Did you hear that? Daniel would stop and listen, but every time, he heard nothing. Sometimes Emily swore she heard something large shifting through the brush, branches flexing, leaves rustling deeper in the forest. Once she was certain she heard something moving parallel to them beyond the trees. But every time she stopped, the sound stopped too, and nothing ever stepped out of the forest. No deer, no birds, no small animals darting through the undergrowth, just trees and silence. By the time they returned to camp that afternoon, the light was already starting to fade behind the mountains. Daniel began gathering wood for the fire, while Emily set up the cooking gear near the tent. For a while, neither of them said anything. The forest felt strangely still. Daniel placed another piece of wood onto the pile beside the fire pit. Then he looked over at Emily. "Hey." Emily glanced up. "Yeah?" Daniel hesitated for a moment. "I've been thinking about something you said earlier." Emily frowned slightly. "What?" "When you kept hearing things moving in the woods." Emily nodded. "Yeah." Daniel looked toward the trees surrounding the clearing. "Did you notice something else?" Emily waited. Daniel spoke slowly. "We've been here 2 days." He gestured toward the forest. "And we haven't seen a single animal." Emily blinked. "What?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "No deer, no birds, nothing." Emily thought back through the last 2 days. The hike in, the walk along the stream, every strange noise she had heard. Her stomach tightened. Daniel was right. Not one. In a valley this remote, animals should have been everywhere. Daniel kept his eyes on the forest. "Does that seem weird to you?" Emily slowly turned her head toward the dark trees surrounding their campsite, because suddenly something else occurred to her. All those noises she had been hearing, the rustling leaves, the shifting branches, the distant cracks deeper in the woods. If there were no animals in the valley, then what had been making those sounds? Darkness came quickly in the valley. One moment the mountains were glowing orange in the last light of the sun. The next, the forest swallowed the clearing in shadow. Daniel finished stacking the firewood, while Emily lit the small camp stove beside the tent. Dinner was simple. Rice, dehydrated vegetables, a small packet of tuna. They sat across from each other while the fire crackled quietly between them. For a while, neither of them spoke. The forest felt different tonight. Emily noticed it first. She tilted her head slightly, listening. The stream was still running beside the clearing. Wind moved faintly through the branches high above. But something else was missing. "Daniel," Emily said quietly. He looked up. "Yeah?" "Listen," Emily said. Daniel paused. The fire popped softly. The stream trickled over stones. Leaves shifted high in the canopy. "What am I listening for?" he asked. Emily frowned. "There should be insects." Daniel listened again. She was right. The valley was completely quiet. No buzzing, no chirping, nothing. Daniel leaned back slightly and scanned the trees beyond the firelight. "Maybe it's just cold tonight," he said. Emily didn't respond. She was still staring toward the dark tree line. A minute passed. Then Emily suddenly stiffened. Daniel noticed immediately. "What?" he asked. Emily raised her hand slowly. "Wait." Her eyes were fixed on the forest. Daniel stayed still, listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then, crack. A branch snapped somewhere beyond the trees. Emily's shoulders tensed. Daniel turned his head toward the sound. Before he could say anything, crunch, another step. He heard that one. Both of them froze. Something had taken 2 slow steps in the forest. Heavy steps, measured. Then the sound stopped. Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Daniel, I'm scared." Daniel leaned toward her. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "I'm here." He slowly reached beside his pack and grabbed the flashlight. For a moment, he didn't move, both of them listening, waiting. Nothing. Daniel clicked the flashlight on and swept the beam across the tree line. The light cut through the darkness. Tree trunks, branches, fern leaves trembling slightly in the wind, but nothing moved. Daniel slowly scanned the clearing again. Nothing. After several long seconds, he lowered the flashlight slightly. The forest remained completely silent. No more footsteps. No movement. Just darkness, and the faint crackle of the fire between them. Whatever had taken those 2 steps had stopped, and it hadn't taken another one since. Morning came slowly to the valley. Thin sunlight filtered through the tall trees, turning the mist above the stream pale gold. Daniel was already crouched beside the fire pit when Emily stepped out of the tent. He was heating water in a small metal pot for coffee. Emily stretched and glanced around the clearing. The forest looked perfectly normal in the daylight. If anything had been moving through the woods the night before, there was no sign of it now. Daniel handed her a metal cup. "You slept for a few hours," he said. Emily took the cup and nodded slightly. For a while they stood quietly, drinking coffee and watching the morning light spread through the valley. Daniel finally spoke. "Probably just a deer." Emily looked at him. "That sounded heavier than a deer." Daniel shrugged. "Wild pigs, maybe?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the edge of the clearing and crouched beside the damp earth near the stream. Daniel noticed immediately. "You checking for tracks?" he asked. Emily nodded. "This ground should show something." The mud beside the water was soft, perfect for footprints. Emily studied it carefully. Then she frowned. "What?" Daniel asked. Emily stood slowly. "There's nothing." Daniel walked over. "What do you mean, nothing?" Emily gestured toward the smooth mud. "No tracks." Daniel scanned the ground. She was right. The mud was completely undisturbed. Not a single print. No hooves. No small animal tracks. Nothing. Daniel straightened slowly. "That's weird." Darkness settled over the valley earlier than the night before. Heavy clouds rolled in over the mountains sometime in the afternoon, blocking the last of the sunlight long before evening truly arrived. By the time Daniel and Emily finished dinner, the forest beyond their small fire was already black. The flames burned low between them. Neither of them spoke much. Emily kept glancing toward the trees. Daniel noticed. "You still thinking about what you said earlier?" he asked. Emily nodded slightly. Daniel leaned forward and added another small piece of wood to the fire. "We're leaving in the morning," he said. Emily looked up at him. "Yeah," she said quietly. Something in her voice made Daniel pause. Emily stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Something is seriously wrong here. I can feel it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The forest around them remained completely still. No insects, no birds, nothing moving in the undergrowth. Just the faint sound of the stream somewhere in the darkness. Daniel shifted closer and wrapped his arms around her. Emily leaned into him. "We'll be okay," he said quietly. "It's just one last night." The fire popped softly between them. Beyond the small circle of light, The forest remained silent, watching. The fire burned down slowly. Eventually, Daniel stood and kicked dirt over the last glowing embers. The darkness beyond the campsite seemed to move closer immediately. "Let's get some sleep," he said quietly. Emily nodded. They stepped into the tent and zipped the door closed behind them. The sound of the zipper seemed strangely loud in the silent valley. Inside, Daniel switched on his headlamp for a moment while they settled in. The beam lit the thin nylon walls of the tent in a pale glow. Beyond it was nothing but darkness. Daniel clicked the light off. The tent fell completely dark. They lay together in their sleeping bag, the fabric rustling softly as they shifted into place. For a while, neither of them slept. Emily lay still, listening. Daniel's arm rested lightly around her. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Emily had just begun drifting towards sleep when she heard it. Crack. Her eyes opened instantly. A branch breaking somewhere in the woods, not far away. Emily didn't move. Beside her, Daniel shifted slightly. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yes." They waited, listening. The darkness outside the tent felt suddenly enormous. Then, crunch. A second step, closer. Daniel froze. He definitely heard that one. Both of them lay perfectly still. Something had taken 2 slow steps in the forest, heavy, deliberate. And then, nothing. Silence returned to the valley. Emily's voice trembled slightly. "Daniel, I'm scared." Daniel pulled her closer. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "I'm here." For a long time, nothing else happened. Emily stayed pressed against Daniel. Neither of them slept. They just listened. The forest outside the tent remained perfectly still. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually, Daniel began to wonder if whatever had taken those 2 steps had simply moved away. Then, crunch. Emily stiffened instantly. The sound came from right beside the tent, so close that the ground beneath it seemed to shift. Daniel felt her grip tighten around him. Neither of them spoke. They listened. Several seconds passed. Then, crunch, another step. This time from somewhere behind the tent. Daniel's stomach tightened, because the sound had moved. Emily whispered softly, "Daniel." He didn't answer. He was listening, counting the distance, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. Then another step sounded in the darkness. Crunch. From the other side of the tent. Emily felt her chest tighten. Her voice trembled. "Daniel, it's moving." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yeah." They lay perfectly still in the darkness. Outside the tent, the slow footsteps continued. One step, silence. Another step, silence. Each one coming from a slightly different place around them. Emily swallowed, her voice barely audible. "It's walking around us." Daniel said nothing, because now he understood. The steps weren't random. They weren't moving away. They were moving in a circle, slow, patient, measured, around the tent. Emily's fingers tightened in the fabric of his shirt. Another slow step sounded in the darkness. Crunch. And then, the footsteps stopped, right beside the tent. Emily could feel the thin nylon wall inches from her face. Neither of them moved. Outside the tent, something shifted its weight. Leaves pressed softly under whatever stood there. Emily swallowed and whispered, "Daniel." "I know," he murmured. They stayed perfectly still, listening. Then the tent wall moved again, just slightly. The nylon pressed inward and slid slowly along the side of the tent, like something brushing against it, feeling it. Emily's breath trembled. Daniel's voice was barely audible. "It's testing us." Emily frowned slightly. "What?" Another faint push against the tent wall, then silence. Daniel spoke again, still whispering. It takes a step, waits, moves again, waits. Emily's eyes widened slightly. It's watching for a reaction. Daniel nodded in the darkness. Outside the tent, another slow step. Crunch, then silence again. Emily's voice dropped even lower. If we just stay here, Daniel finished the thought. It thinks we're prey. The word hung quietly in the darkness. Emily tightened her grip on him. What do we do? Daniel thought for a moment. Then he whispered, we make it think we're not. Emily slowly understood. They couldn't hide. They couldn't act scared, because whatever was circling their tent was deciding whether they were worth attacking. Another step sounded outside. Crunch. Emily whispered, what do we do? Daniel thought for only a moment. Then he leaned close to her ear. When I count to 3, we make as much noise as possible. Emily nodded slightly in the darkness. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight. Outside the tent, another slow step, moving along the wall. Testing. Waiting. Daniel whispered, 1. Emily took a breath. 2. Another faint shift in the leaves outside. Then Daniel suddenly roared, hey! The flashlight exploded on, blasting white light through the thin nylon wall. Daniel slammed his hand against the side of the tent. Get out of here! Emily shouted with him, hitting the tent wall with both hands. The nylon snapped outward with each strike. For a split second, there was movement outside. Something tall, a shadow shifting in the beam of light through the fabric. Then, crash. Branches snapped violently in the darkness. Something large moved through the trees, fast. The sound of heavy movement tore through the silent forest. Then suddenly, it stopped. Daniel froze, listening. The forest returned to silence. Emily's breathing was shaking now. Did it leave? She whispered. Daniel didn't answer right away. He slowly lowered the flashlight, because the sounds hadn't moved far. They had only moved into the trees, and now the forest was quiet again, like something standing just beyond the darkness. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Daniel kept the flashlight pointed toward the tent wall. Emily stayed pressed against him inside the sleeping bag, listening for even the smallest sound. But the forest outside remained perfectly still. No footsteps, no shifting leaves, nothing. Emily whispered, why isn't it moving? Daniel didn't answer right away. He was thinking. It knows we're here, he murmured. Emily nodded. Then why just stand there? Daniel glanced toward the thin nylon wall of the tent. Maybe it doesn't like what it can't see. Emily frowned slightly. What do you mean? If it's a predator, Daniel whispered, it wants to know what it's dealing with. Emily thought for a moment. Then she said quietly, Daniel. Yeah? What if we move the tent? Daniel blinked. Move the tent? Just a little. Emily pointed toward the ground beside the wall. If we push the tent forward a bit, the bottom edge will lift. Daniel understood immediately. And we can see underneath. Emily nodded, just enough to see what kind of prints are out there. Daniel hesitated. The thing outside still hadn't moved. That was almost worse than hearing it walk. But sitting there doing nothing felt worse. Okay, he whispered. They shifted carefully inside the sleeping bag, each of them grabbing the lower edge of the tent wall. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight. Ready? Emily nodded. Together, they pushed. The lightweight tent slid forward a few inches across the ground. The bottom edge of the nylon lifted slightly from the soil, just enough for the flashlight beam to slip underneath. Daniel angled the light downward. The beam cut across the dirt outside the tent. Emily felt her stomach drop. The ground was covered in prints, not hooves, not paws, not human. Long impressions pressed deep into the soil. Marks from something that had been circling the tent, over and over and over again. Emily whispered, Daniel, But Daniel wasn't looking at the prints anymore. He was staring past them, into the darkness beyond the flashlight beam. Something was out there, standing just outside the light, not moving, just watching. Daniel slowly lowered the flashlight. The thin nylon tent suddenly felt very small. "If it comes through the wall," he whispered, "this won't stop it." Emily nodded. Then she reached beside her pack. A moment later, she pulled out the camping knife. The blade caught the faint edge of the flashlight beam. Daniel looked at her. "What are you doing?" Emily pointed toward the tent floor. "If it tries to grab us, we'll be trapped." Daniel immediately understood. Emily pressed the blade into the nylon beneath them. The fabric split with a soft rip. She cut a short slit just wide enough for a hand to reach through. Then she handed the knife to Daniel. "If it comes in..." Daniel gripped the handle tightly. "We make it regret it." Outside the tent, the forest remained completely silent, and just beyond the edge of the flashlight beam, something tall was still standing there. For a long moment, nothing happened. Daniel kept the flashlight angled toward the small gap beneath the tent wall. Emily stayed pressed against him inside the sleeping bag, listening. "Maybe it won't attack us." Daniel didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "It hasn't yet." Emily swallowed. "Maybe the tent is enough." Daniel looked around the thin nylon walls. It didn't make sense, but the creature had circled them for hours, and it never came in. Maybe it wasn't sure what they were. Then something moved outside. The dirt shifted just beyond the beam of the flashlight. A shadow passed slowly across the ground, and suddenly, rip! The side of the tent tore open. A long claw punched through the nylon. Emily gasped. The curved talons scraped through the fabric, slicing a jagged hole in the wall. Cold night air rushed inside. Daniel swung the flashlight toward it. The claw withdrew slightly, then pushed through the tear again, feeling, testing the opening. The creature had been patient, but now the tent was damaged, and the barrier between them was gone. Emily's voice shook. "Daniel." The claw scraped across the ground inside the tent, searching. Then something else pushed through the torn fabric. A dark shape forcing its way through the opening. A nose, large, wet, sniffing. The creature inhaled deeply, testing the air, smelling them. Daniel tightened his grip on the knife. The creature inhaled again. The claw pushed farther into the tent. Daniel realized instantly what had happened. The tent had protected them, but now it was torn. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the creature pushed down. The back of the tent collapsed suddenly. The ripped nylon folded inward as something enormous leaned its weight against it. The thin poles bent. The wall of the tent pressed down toward them. Emily screamed, "Daniel!" The claw forced deeper through the torn fabric. The nose shoved farther inside, sniffing, pushing. The creature knew exactly what it was doing. It was forcing them out. The tent buckled again as more weight pressed down from above. Daniel didn't think. There wasn't time. "Go!" he shouted. "Run!" They tore at the tent door together. The zipper snagged for a split second. Then the nylon ripped open as they forced their way through. Cold night air exploded around them. Emily burst out first, Daniel right behind her. She grabbed his arm instinctively, trying to pull him with her. "Come on!" For half a second they ran together. Then Daniel jolted backward, hard. Emily stumbled as his arm was suddenly ripped from her grasp. Something had grabbed him. Daniel shouted as he was yanked violently into the darkness beside the tent. Emily turned just in time to see the towering shape unfolding behind him. Long limbs, too thin, too tall. Daniel slammed the knife toward it. "Run!" he shouted again. Emily froze for a split second, then survival took over. She ran. Behind her, she heard Daniel shouting, branches snapping, the sound of something massive crashing through the trees. Then, a horrible scream echoed through the valley. And suddenly, everything went quiet again. Emily didn't look back. She just kept running. Branches whipped past her face as she pushed through the forest. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Her lungs burned. Adrenaline drowned out everything else. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. She just had to get away. She kept running, through ferns, over fallen logs, across uneven ground. Then suddenly, her foot slipped. The ground vanished beneath her. Emily cried out as she tumbled forward. She rolled down a steep forest embankment. Dirt and leaves filled her mouth. Branches scraped her arms as she slid. She tried to grab something, anything, but the slope was too steep. She tumbled again. Then suddenly, she stopped. Emily lay still for a moment, stunned. Her body ached. Her chest heaved as she tried to control her breathing. Slow, quiet, don't make noise. She wiped dirt from her face. Then she listened. The forest above her remained silent. For a moment, she thought she had lost it. Maybe the creature had stayed behind. Maybe she had gotten far enough away. Then she heard it. A low sound. Not footsteps, not branches. A soft, hungry growl. Emily froze. The sound came from somewhere nearby. Another growl followed. Higher pitched, lighter, immature. Then another. And another. Emily slowly lifted her head. The ground around her shifted slightly. Dark shapes moved among the leaves. Small, thin, too many of them. Her blood ran cold, because suddenly she understood. The valley had been empty. No animals, no birds, nothing alive. Not because the creature hunted there, because this place was its den. And the things moving toward her now weren't the creature from the tent. They were its babies, hungry. If you enjoyed tonight's story, subscribe for more original horror. And until next time, if you ever find a valley where the forest feels empty, no birds, no animals, no sound at all, you might want to leave. Because sometimes, a place isn't quiet. Sometimes, it's already been eaten.